The TRIPS Agreement, the World Trade Organization Agreement on Trade-Related Aspects of Intellectual Property Rights, includes a very important provision on technical cooperation. This is an integral part of the agreement. It's part of the deal, if you like. And I think it's important to understand this provision, and even more important, to make sure it's implemented effectively for the benefit of WTO members. It's there for a reason. I'm quite conscious of this from a personal perspective, because my work has involved this provision from several directions. From the vantage point of a colleague in the past, a cooperating organisation, the World Intellectual Property Organization, still very much our most important partner here in the WTO in the field of intellectual property, and a partner for our technical cooperation activities in the area of intellectual property, fundamentally important partner. I've also had experience as a government official in one of the countries that has as an obligation under the TRIPS agreement to provide technical cooperation on request to other WTO members. I've had experience preparing reports about how this provision is implemented. I've had a lot of experience in consuming those reports and trying to make sense of them, trying to get a sense of the broader trends and significant aspects of the programs that are reported. And working here in the WTO, in the Secretariat, a responsibility with colleagues for compiling and disseminating the information contained in these reports. So I hope by the end of this presentation at least, you might agree with me, if you don't agree already, that this provision is well worth our attention, above all that it's well worth our while working to ensure that we have better information about its implementation, and that we have a better framework for coordinating and cooperating in its delivery. I do think coordination is very important. It's the most effective way of ensuring that resources always limited in some way, those resources are applied most effectively for the benefit of the WTO members for whose benefit this provision actually exists. So what I'd like to do is to reflect a little on the very nature of the TRIPS provision for technical cooperation, then consider some of the early decisions of the TRIPS Council concerning its implementation and concerning reporting and dialogue about technical cooperation. And then we can look at some of the insights that we can glean from the massive amounts of information that have been reported concerning its implementation. One of the ironies here is that there's so much information in the reports that have been submitted over the years that it's hard to get a broader picture. There's a great deal of data, if you like, but to get worthwhile policy information from that about overall directions, overall priorities, that takes a bit more digging to do. And thankfully, colleagues have been able to work through the detailed information to pull out some really interesting insights. And I hope then to conclude that this would form the basis for a richer series of conversations about how to make the most of the technical cooperation programs that are available, and above all, how to best to match the resources available, the programs that exist, with the needs and priorities of developing countries and least developed countries. Needs, priorities, practical circumstances that, of course, evolve over time, have evolved very considerably in the years since the TRIPS agreement came into force. So let's turn to the provision itself, Article 67. of the TRIPS agreement on technical cooperation, and it's worth looking again at the contents. So it sets up an obligation. It is an obligation. It's the word shall that is your clue. This is a legal obligation on the part of developed country WTO members. And what's the obligation? It is to provide on request and on mutually agreed terms and conditions technical and financial cooperation in favour of developing and least developed country members. So yes, it's an obligation, but it's also establishes this framework for dialogue, or for matching of supply and demand, if you like. So the key point here is, yes, it's an obligation on the part of developed countries, but the trigger is the request by developing countries, by LDCs, and the idea of mutually agreed terms. So it's not simply a unilateral cooking up of a program and delivering it. It is based on demand, on needs that are identified, and the arrangements are on mutually agreed terms. There's some examples of the kind of cooperation that's involved. This is not exhaustive, but it is a requirement. So the Article 7 says that this cooperation shall include assistance in the preparation of laws and regulations on the protection and enforcement of intellectual property rights. Also, concerning laws and regulations on the prevention of the abuse of intellectual property rights. It also covers support regarding the establishment or reinforcement of domestic officers and agencies relevant to these matters, including the training of personnel. So a fairly broad remit, and as I say, not necessarily exhaustive. And indeed, when we look at the practice of members since the TRIPS agreement came into force in 1995, we've seen not only diversity in the kinds of technical and financial cooperation involved, but increasing diversity, and I think this is of interest in itself. That said, we have seen quite a number of programs corresponding to these specific requirements, that's for sure. Although I would say that in our review, the focus has been more on the preparation of laws and regulations early on in the implementation of TRIPS, not so much, at least explicitly, on the question of prevention of the abuse of IP rights, although that may be implicit in some of the programs, and certainly plenty of support regarding the building up of the administrative infrastructure and the training of personnel for domestic intellectual property systems. But more of that when we look at the specific reports that have been covered. So early on in the life of the TRIPS agreement, the TRIPS Council considered this provision, discussed what its implementation would mean in practice, and made two important decisions. The first was to establish a network of contact points, and the idea was to identify contact points in each member to promote the exchange of information between the providers and the recipients of technical assistance. This contact point system has since been developed, implemented, initially through a series of documents whereby members identified their contact points, developed country members identified their contact points. I had the honour to be on that contact point list for some time, but more recently this has been transitioned to a digital online form as part of our overall e-TRIPS gateway. What I would like to say is that it's my personal belief, looking at this system from several directions, that the contact point system has been greatly underutilised. Its potential is there, but its potential, frankly, has not been fully realised. And indeed, we have possibly a negative feedback loop here, in that the contact points are not necessarily updated frequently enough, and quite a number are known to be well out of date, and therefore the incentive, the interest in making use of the contact point system is reduced, because there's no guarantee that you'll actually contact the person that you need to contact. But early on, and this is 1996, members did decide to establish this system, and it's our firm belief in the Secretariat that this system can be used much more effectively. Indeed, it's easier to use now because the contact points are so much easier to access, and easier, for that matter, to update and keep up to date. So that was the first significant decision made, to establish a network of contact points so that developing countries and least developed countries seeking technical assistance would know where to go to, would know who to approach for the kind of technical and financial assistance they were looking for, and from that point of view they're entitled to within the terms of this Article 67. Looking at the submissions of contact points, we see in this chart quite a mixed picture. The majority of the contact points we have notified are well out of date, I would say. They were notified before 2011, so well over a decade ago, and without going into details, we're quite conscious that a number of these are simply out of date. Only a small number have been updated since 2017, just over 5% since 2017, and for over a quarter of the members concerned, there's been no submission of a contact point. So this is not a network, shall we say, in the best of health. It's something that we really can look at improving. It's a very much low-hanging fruit. It's not difficult to update and publicise these contact points. And again, speaking personally, I honestly believe that there's every amount of good faith and willingness to make this system work, which is why, as a Secretariat, we really do want to step out and encourage members to update their contact points and to use this system as it's intended to. There's quite a range of possibilities in its use, which we'd like to explore in our continuing dialogue with members. But it's there for a reason. Members decided to set it up early on in the life of the TRIPS agreement. Let's make it work. The other important decision that was made early on in the life of the TRIPS agreement by the TRIPS Council as such was for a regular reporting process on the kind of programs, activities that were delivered under the framework of Article 67 on technical cooperation. So the chair at that time, and to quote, noted that there was agreement among members that the TRIPS Council should seek the annual updating by developed country members of information on their technical cooperation activities. And the chair also noted at that time that having full information on these activities was important, so that Council would be in a position to have a worthwhile discussion about technical cooperation. So the understanding at that time is that there would be a dialogue about technical cooperation, about the kind of programs that had been delivered. He noted the willingness, the chair at that time noted the willingness of members to share this information, and I think also critically to find ways of matching supply and demand in respect of technical assistance. So it's not just paperwork for its own sake. There is an annual report, and ever since then, this is in 1996, ever since then there have been annual reports of technical assistance programs from a wide range of developed country members. But this is not purely for transparency. It's always valuable, not purely for transparency, but there's two concrete reasons for this. Firstly, to have a richer, more informed dialogue in the TRIPS Council about technical cooperation, so that there's a greater mutual understanding across the membership about what technical cooperation is implemented, what its impact is, how it's useful. And secondly, to promote the matching of supply and demand. The needs that have been identified for technical assistance are diverse, are evolving all the time, and it's not necessarily obvious to know what's the right source to go to for support in this area, whether it's training specialist personnel, training customs officials on enforcement matters, updating the laws concerning registrability of trademarks, considering developing specialist judges in the area of intellectual property, training more broadly, training government officials, ministries well beyond the traditional scope of intellectual property. There's so many different possibilities, and it's not obvious initially who to approach to discuss. Well, let's talk about technical cooperation. Let's align the resources available with the needs that have been identified. So early on in this process, there was an expectation of using this information to help match supply and demand. So I think these are really important principles. This was the objective established by WTO members in the TRIPS Council early on, and almost a generation later, it's time to think about how to make that most effective in the contemporary environment. That's what we hope this conversation will lead to.